All right, all yours, Andy.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Today is Monday, September 9th, 2019. This is the AWS Cluster API Office Hours meeting. It's a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Let me go ahead and get my screen sharing set up here. Just a minute so I can get the meeting notes up. All right, if you have access to the document, please go ahead and add yourself to the attending list and any agenda items that you might want to talk about, and we will get to it. So PSA V1 Alpha 2, this is Kappa 0.4 is out, and also the corresponding cluster API and the Kubernetes Bootstrap provider releases are out as well. So all of these are using the V1 Alpha 2 APIs. If you are looking for new features, they generally need to go into V1 Alpha 3 at this point, which we'll be planning starting next week. So anything else that any of y'all want to say about V1 Alpha 2?
This might be a good time to bring up Vince's agenda item for the Getting Started guide.
Sure, we can move that up. So since we are talking about Alpha 2, Vince, you want to take it over?
Yeah, I just added a link to the PR. So
hold on.
This PR up.
Sorry, I just have to sign back in. You can go ahead.
Okay.
And talk.
The PR updates the Getting Started guide, which kind of like was more targeted towards V1 Alpha 1, and it offers like kind of like it's more like a prerequisite that a Getting Started guide like that I have to agree with. So there's definitely something to be done around naming. What I want to try to avoid is have the docs in two places and update both at the same time, like over time. So the quick start in Cappy has kind of like everything that like a user has to go through to update or like to create a cluster, to go from 0 to cluster. This guide would like more be geared towards like how to set up your environment before going to the quick start. So maybe instead of like having this for more in-depth documentation, at the end we can have like link to the quick start instead. What do you all think?
So, well, here let's take a look at the quick start. So I think this is a really good way to get a cluster up and running. It tells you need kube control, you need kind or some other management cluster. Here's how you install the cluster API components, Kubernetes Bootstrapper, and then here you get to an infrastructure provider, and obviously we're AWS. So like this is where it's basically saying there's some prerequisites that you need to do. Mm-hmm. I think that's totally fine to say, okay, like you need to now go to some document in Kappa. I wouldn't call it a getting started guide for what's in here. I think this is the Kappa prerequisites, and we can have some text in here that says this is information that you need to read and most likely execute in order to be able to use Kappa. But so like go ahead and do this stuff so that you get your CloudFormation stack and your credentials and whatnot set up. But this is not going to be a how-to quick start guide. And for that, you need to go back to over here.
Yeah, we can even make this a little bit more like of a warning. If you go like maybe if you click on vSphere, I'm not sure if like that has a warning, but like if you scroll down, one of the YAMLs has.
Yeah, I remember.
vSphere. Yeah, we can make it like this, like action required. You need to do the prerequisites and go here to do them, kind of thing.
What do you think, Jason?
So I'm a bit torn. People who are used to V1 Alpha 1 are probably going to get thrown for a loop when they try to get started with V1 Alpha 2 if they start from the provider side.
Yeah, but if they start from the provider side and we have a link that says you must go here to figure out.
Yeah. but I also worry a bit because we don't go into detail about like what the different settings are in this version of the quick start, which is where I would expect us to kind of get into on the AWS provider side. So I guess I'm not sure where we provide that level
Which
of detail
settings in
yet.
particular?
Well, so like if you go back to the cluster API book and like you go down to the cluster definition for AWS, we don't really specify, other than just saying like, here's the region. We don't go into any of the other settings about, the using a VPC, existing VPC. And if we get to the machine level, we really don't provide much context on what those machine level settings are either.
Okay, so I'm hearing a few different things, which I think are all valid. One is we need to probably fully document AWS cluster and AWS machine in Kappa. Another one is some of the more advanced scenarios that you don't get out of the box, like bringing your own VPC. And I'm not sure off the top of my head how we would necessarily do those. I think I agree with Vince that I like all of this stuff that says here's where you get Cappy and here's where you get the Bootstrap provider and here's how you install a provider. Like I don't well, and here's how you do a cluster, an AWS cluster and machine and so on. I don't necessarily want to copy and paste this over to Kappa and then have different scenarios for VP, bring your own VPC or not, right?
Yeah, the other thing that I worry about is we specified in this quick start, the common quick start, to go to the provider specified docs for the latest examples. So
Do we?
would we just maintain those in Cappy now rather than the providers themselves? And that's where I get a little confused about bouncing back to Cappy, because some of the users who may be contributing to the AWS docs, they may not be contributors to Core Cluster API as well.
Right. Chuck, you've got your hand
one
up.
quick side note, yeah. If you wanted to fully document the cluster object, one thing we do in kubeadm is fully document the kubeadm configuration objects in GoDoc, so you can actually see them through godoc.org, which I think is nice. But
I think we do have that. We don't have links to it though.
oh, I see. Okay, I didn't realize that we documented them already.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer quickly on this.
I mean, I think ideally we'd be able to document these bits as part of the provider, and then we can embed from the provider specified docs into the quick start.
Yeah, so I think that would be like a really nice thing to do. The problem is that these docs are generated, right? Like if we grab a link, then it will be a build time only kind of that will change. Does that sound like if we merge a PR in AWS to update one of these, then it wouldn't be like an iframe, you know what I mean?
I mean, we could probably also set up like a periodic job to publish the docs as well.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I mean, I could do we could do like some sort of like preprocessor to just pull like a markdown document in Kappa and just put it here. Even these examples, right? I'll be fine with that.
So if you go to, just make sure I understand what was being suggested. So if you go to Kappa, are you saying we would have this sort of content in Kappa as well as Cappy?
I think what we're saying is that like for the AWS like embedded pit,
yeah,
we would have those hosted in Kappa, and when we build the book, we just say here's the link to find the markdown document. Please embed it in this one. That makes sense.
Yeah, I did get that. I was kind of going back to Jason's original request that this sort of stuff be fully self-contained in Kappa's documentation?
I think that would satisfy most of my concerns to do the auto generation with the actual artifacts that we're pulling in being in the provider based repo.
But what about, okay, so what about bring your own VPC? Like that's not going to show up in this quick start, right?
I mean, that's something that we can likely document as an advanced scenario. We'd still need some story around that, but yeah.
Okay, so we keep this content in Cappy. We find some way to periodically pull and build the AWS specific or the provider specific bits. And what do we do with this content that is in Vince's PR? Just adjust it to say these are prerequisites for running Kappa.
I think that sounds good to me.
Yeah, because we still have the chicken and egg that you have to run the prerequisites before you can run the Cafe Quick Start.
Yeah, there's so many chicken and eggs around. Yeah, I think this is a good plan. I'll open an issue in Cappy to do the remote preprocessor, and we can find some naming convention around this too, like in that we go look in the docs directory or something. So every other provider can do this as well.
Yeah, and I think we probably need to rename this to like prerequisites.md and make this more focused around prereqs than getting started.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Anything else on this topic? All right. Andrew, I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So thank you for letting me join. I realize that what I'll be talking about and asking from you guys is not super productive for your goals. So I appreciate this time. So let me just lay out I work for Capital One, and I'm on a team that is building out a Kubernetes platform here. And we are very interested in, like, we want to be able to have our platform management all automated. So we're very interested in Cluster API. There are a couple of things that make it tricky, that reasons why we can't just use Kappa as it is. One is that all of our instances in AWS are our VPCs are air gapped. So it's not permitted to grant the IAM permissions to create and update and manage security groups, or IAM roles for that matter. And other things like creating VPCs and subnets are a very, very tall order that we would need to get. So that's difficult. So we have, because we already have operating Kubernetes clusters, we do have security groups that work for us and IAM roles that work for us, as well as we have dedicated subnets for this initiative. So what we're wanting to end up with is something that's very similar to Kappa, but that means that allows us to specify the security groups, IAM roles, and subnets and whatnot that it should use. So I wanted a couple of things. I wanted to understand what your guys' feeling would be about, like, whether we should sort of fork Kappa for our own needs, maybe provide these capabilities as PRs that you guys could review, or just simply start from scratch with our own thing. And secondly, I don't have a great understanding of how Cluster API v1 Alpha 2 works. I see that there's the concept of a provider, an infrastructure provider, which is like the actuators. So that would be the thing that provides the infrastructure. I'm not very clear on how the controller, the Bootstrap controller, exactly what it does and how it's consumed. I imagine it's providing Bootstrap scripts for instances, but how that's consumed, I'm not sure. And I'd also point out that I think we would have to provide our own. We have a set of custom made Bootstrap scripts that get around the fact that we have to use specific proxies, and all of the things we install, they have to be in. We can't just use apt-get. We have to set up. We have to configure local deb repositories, mirrors for those things and whatnot. So we've had to develop our own Bootstrap scripts. So yeah, so I kind of wanted to just like level up my understanding of CAPI and of Kappa, and see what your guys' thoughts are about like the direction we should take. Yeah.
So I think the first thing I'll make a comment on is as far as fork or contribute towards the existing cluster AWS provider. I would say it might be best to take an approach of both. So right now for V1 Alpha 1 or V1 Alpha 2, obviously we don't support your use case. Specifically, the thing that I heard is around the security groups in particular. I think with the VPC and the subnets, we already have that covered to be able to use existing ones. But we definitely try to attempt to create the security groups today per cluster. I think that's something that we would like to support in the future. However, I would highly suspect that that would require an API level change, which would mean the earliest we could probably adapt to that for the upstream provider would be for V1 Alpha 3. And that's something that I think we'd definitely like to figure out how we can do that. But if you need something before then, the real option would be to go ahead and fork it.
Okay, that makes sense. So for V1 Alpha 3, so that means that if I were to implement that capability on V1 Alpha 2 and provide a PR, are you saying it wouldn't be considered for merging until after V1 Alpha 3 is released, or prior to that?
Well, it would be we would be able to merge it, but it wouldn't be part of a release until we cut the first V1 Alpha 3 release.
Okay, cool. So we could. That's great. I just wanted to understand whether it would be a good idea for us to just start implementing that and then provide it to you. Cool.
Yeah, master is open for breaking changes, although we haven't gone through any planning sessions yet, so that'll be next week. I did want to touch on the bootstrapping. So first I'll explain how the bootstrap mechanism works in Alpha 2, and then we can talk more about your needs. We have two ways to supply bootstrapping information to the infrastructure provider so that when it creates, in this case, an EC2 instance, it has bootstrap data. One is you can just generate your data however you feel like, and when you create your machine, you can specify the bootstrap data as a string on the machine. So if you have some way to manually come up with that, you can do that. The other is to use a bootstrap provider, and we have one reference implementation that uses kubeadm. So pretty much all of the logic that was in Kappa V1 Alpha 1, Cap V V1 Alpha 1, I think maybe even the Azure provider, they were all copying and pasting generally the same code that was looking at the cluster and machine objects, the provider specs, and coming up with kubeadm bootstrap data that was for cloud init. And what we did is we said, we don't want to copy and paste this around anymore, so let's move this into a separate provider. And what that does now is it's meant to be as generic as possible, although there are certain assumptions and prerequisites about the base images that you are using to launch your VMs that are required. So we fully expect and require that kube control and kubeadm and kubelet are all pre-installed. I don't know about kube control, but kubelet and kubeadm are pre-installed in your virtual machine. And you may or may not want to bake in images, your container images for the API server and etcd and whatnot. It's sort of up to you if you want to do that or not, but we support both. And so once you have those base images for EC2, the AMIs that have what's necessary, then you would create a machine and an AWS machine and a kubeadm config, and that combination of those three would result in the cloud init bootstrap data being generated for your machine, and EC2 would use it when provisioning the instance. So you mentioned apt-get. We don't apt-get anywhere as part of the kubeadm bootstrap process. So if you need to do software installation, then you could do that in a custom bootstrap script, although we recommend you do it in your base image in your AMI and have it baked in so that you don't have to install anything at startup.
Yeah, that would be ideal. There isn't a very good story at Capital One for baking images. There is a very strict process. There's very strict controls on the armies that are used. They're created by a separate team, and then they're kind of released into our accounts, and then we consume them. And because of the amount of churn around our bootstrap scripts, which is less these days, but because of the amount of churn, we figured it would be better just to have our tool upload the scripts to S3 and have just a little hook that we provide in user data that pulls everything down, and don't expect anything to be pre-installed. So we install kubelet and Docker and some other bits and pieces that the organization expects for us to be in compliance. We do it all from base images. We would like to start baking images, but it's something that there is a way to do it, but it's been on the back burner because we've just had bigger fish to fry. We have working good bootstrap scripts, so we just need a way to be able to inject them into our instances.
Are you using kubeadm to do your bootstrapping?
No, it's all bash. It's all just bash, and just install Docker, install kubelet, set up some other things, and then generate some manifests for the system components.
Okay. I'm just curious that this is around upgrades and logistics. Do you run etcd co-located with the control plane VMs, or is etcd managed elsewhere?
It's federated in its own auto-scaling group. We want to move it to be co-located with the master nodes, but that's another one that we've just had lower hanging fruit to get to.
All right, so given that you have custom bootstrapping, you could either write a provider that can generate bootstrap data for your machines, and you could have it do both halves. You could have it upload to S3 if you need like a per machine script, or if it's always the same thing or mostly the same thing, and what's in S3 is fairly common. You could just have the cloud init portion that's generated. So you could do it either or both.
So one other option too is if you are able to leverage kubeadm for install, and all you really need to do is get the prerequisites installed at kind of instance stand-up time, you might be able to inject that as part of the kubeadm config object, where we give you the option to specify either pre or post commands to run before or after kubeadm. And you might be able to specify that as part of the pre-commands to basically pull down and execute that script to install the prerequisites.
Yeah, that's worth looking at. My preference would be if there was a way that we could simply lift and shift what we have now and not make any modifications, because they're quite difficult to test as they are. Yeah, and they're somewhat brittle. So, but we are going to have to make a pretty significant departure from our current architecture anyway. So yeah, I think we'll be running down all these avenues, and we'll probably end up with the most expedient thing that doesn't add too much tech debt in the near future. What is the mechanism by which the Bootstrap controller actually delivers like the user data that needs to end up on the instances? Does it create config maps or?
So right now, in Alpha 2, so we have this type called kubeadm config. This is a CRD. It is a first-class resource, and on the status, we have two required fields: ready and bootstrap data. Bootstrap data is just a byte array. We've had some comments about maybe making this a reference to a secret, so that if there were any private data, that could be in a secret instead of just in plain text in a kubeadm config status. But that's not changing for what we just released in Alpha 2. So in Alpha 2, it's just in this bootstrap data. If you are writing a provider, you would flip ready to true, fill in the bootstrap data, and then the bootstrap provider's job is done at that point. It is the cluster API machine controller that is responsible for pulling this data from the kubeadm config status or whatever your type is, and putting it into the machine.
That's cool. That's very cool. Okay, so to me, and so I suppose then after running your bootstrap data, if there is any, it then runs kubeadm with some generated command.
Yeah. So just to show you, I'll get back to that in just a second. So in the cluster API machine spec, we have a bootstrap field, and bootstrap is, where did you go? Bootstrap has a config ref and data. So config ref would be if you want to do your own provider or you want to use the reference provider, you would put a reference to a kubeadm config or your type. And then in either situation, whether you're using a provider or not, eventually this data field gets filled in either by hand or we copy it. And then once this is populated, the machine controller, the infrastructure controller, and Kappa in this case, would know that it can go ahead and create an EC2 instance.
Okay, so I think the path of least resistance for us is going to be making our own implementation based on the kubeadm provider that does everything that one does except run kubeadm.
So the kubeadm provider will do some certificate management if you're not specifying certificates, and so it'll generate those for you. And then it also will generate the kubeadm config, the init, cloud, or join configurations, and then it'll generate the cloud init data that's got all of that in there. So it sounds to me like you might be better off. I mean, you could copy and paste what's in the kubeadm provider just to have a template, but you probably would rip 90% of the code out that's doing anything that's kubeadm related.
Yeah, we really just need that bootstrap We just need to be able to provide the Bootstrap script. The way certificates work is we have a couple of models. We're deprecating one of them. So we wrote our own CLI, which generates a set of initial certificates and it uploads them to S3, and then those are pulled down to instances. We're deprecating that in favor of the other strategy, which is it integrates with our Enterprise Vault solution, which has some proprietary sugar that we have had to, write some custom code to get certs for, and I haven't looked very closely at kubeadm. I don't know if it natively can just pull certificates from Vault. I don't know if the custom sort of stuff that they've built here around our Enterprise Vault would make it sort of a non-standard, like if a tool expects to be able to use Vault, I don't know if it will be able to use our Vault. So I'd like to avoid having to go into those problems by just going here instance, here is a Bootstrap script that we know works.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so yeah. So I guess you're right that we would have to rip out a lot of the code, but I think it would probably be better than trying to start from a blank repository, because I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, unfortunately, the development guide is blank at this point for lots of things for Alpha 2, but we're here to help. So you have API types that you would create, just like that kubeadm config that we were looking at, and then you really just need a single controller, and you can copy and paste a good portion of the logic that's in this reconcile function. A lot of it's boilerplate, where we're going to retrieve the object, and we short circuit if it's already ready. We go ahead and find the machine that's associated with this kubeadm config. If the machine already has been initialized, then we short circuit. We go try and find the cluster. And then I would say at this point, all of this code is where you would put in your logic to generate whatever you need to generate, because this is doing stuff like figuring out if the control plane's been initialized or not, and if it hasn't, then we make sure that we get one control plane machine that's allowed to initialize and the other ones have to wait, and if we have any non-control plane machines, they have to wait as well. This is all kubeadm related stuff, and then eventually we'll deal with some certificate stuff and spit out join data for kubeadm. So all of this stuff that's beyond really just getting the cluster and the machine and the kubeadm config, you would rip that out and replace it with whatever you need.
So the timing of this, it looks like this executes after the cluster has kind of come up and the control plane is responding.
No. The cluster infrastructure ready is just making sure that if there's any cluster infrastructure that needs to be brought up, like say a load balancer, that's up and ready prior to running any of the other steps, whether it's init or join.
And Chuck has a diagram here for us. Thank you, Chuck.
Excellent. That is great.
Yeah, this should just show the sequence diagram of all the interactions.
All right.
So it might be something to look at later on to see exactly how this works. Yeah,
I'll definitely need to take my team through this and try to understand it myself. Fantastic. Okay. Well, I think I know how we can begin. We're eager to get started on a proof of concept, and then how about we assuming I'm sure I'll have a ton of questions over the next few weeks, but how about I then bring what we've built and show you guys, and we can figure out, if there's any of it that we should rip out and contribute as pull requests and stuff like that.
That sounds good. I do want to just circle back and around the do you fork or not? If you are making changes specifically around bringing your own security groups, I think there's every reason that we should include that in Kappa, because we allow you to bring your own VPC and subnets. So happy to have you start by filing an issue if there isn't one already about it. Certainly you and your team obviously can go develop it independently, but we'll take it in for merging into master eventually. So that's a long way of saying we'd love for you to contribute that.
Awesome. I think one other thing, I think we'll also want to be, oh no, I was going to say bringing our own load balancers, but that's crazy. No, this will definitely be creating load balancers. Where do you think you could point me to the area of the code where you would expect that we would need to do the bit that says have any security groups being provided in config? Okay, use those.
Sure. So I kind of want to go look at the managed VPC, some of those chunks of code. What do you think, Jason or Vince or Chuck or Liz? I mean, in general, the security groups are in cluster, right?
Yeah.
You can just look at securitygroups.go and yeah, this is where they kind of get created.
But all of this is hard coded, right?
Yeah, today this is all hard coded. Yeah.
Do we have anything in the API around security groups or permissions?
We have additional security groups, I believe.
Okay. Cluster or machine?
I think machine, because they're per machine. One question that I had for Andrew is are the security groups something that's going to be pre-created for you? You just need to use them. Can you give some direction, like at the network team, I guess, around naming or tags to add, or it's just you got to use this ID and that's it?
Yeah, yeah. Here's the ID. Use that. The process here. So, security groups here are seen as a critical security control point, and as such, they built a mechanism to allow for people to request changes around security groups. There is an enterprise GitHub workflow where there's an information security officer and an architect have to manually review it and give approval. Then it can be merged into an upstream Git repository that we don't have permissions to write to directly. And then once that's there, then we can run a CLI tool that can then apply the changes in the account. So obviously we cannot automate any of that. I guess we could make a tool that can generate new security groups to feed into that thing, but it would still have to go through that process.
Because if you want to do that today for just security groups, if you use the same names and you change the tags so that they're not owned by Kappa, we'll still need to describe them, but we won't create them for you, and you can add any rules that you want. If that makes sense.
So if we just applied tag, which by the way, this process doesn't give us any way to add tags to security groups, but
okay, yeah, that's
yeah. The problem would be is that they would need to be defined for each cluster, the tags.
Yeah.
that
Yep.
those security groups are used for.
Right.
So, but going back to the original question, like if you want to like kind of do like bring in your security groups, you would need something for like these 4 categories. I guess like a bastion, like we talked about disabling it or like having an option to disable the bastion. But control plane node and load balancer, you will need at least these 3.
Uh-huh.
So I guess like given that these are hard coded because like they're always required, like for the 80% use case, I guess we could say like in the spec, like you just say like this is the security group ID that you need to use for this role, and then
Yeah.
you can add additional one if you want to each machine individually.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. I wish it was as simple as this role uses this security group. There are 2 security groups that are provided to us by the enterprise, which must be applied to every instance in our account. So there's 2 already. Then we have a security group which we apply to every Kubernetes node, regardless of its role. And then we have specific roles for etcd, worker, and master nodes. And then we have a security group for our control plane load balancer, and we have a security group for our workers, or a set of our workers, which allow a couple of node ports which we use to route to our Nginx ingress controller, because obviously because we can't modify security groups, we have to have static node ports in order to provide ingresses. So there will be, what we'll end up with is each role will have a set of security groups. And we're also going to, I hope we're not going to run into difficulty when differentiating between etcd and master nodes. We may actually take this up as an opportunity to consolidate those, so that we don't have to treat them as different things.
I'm almost wondering if it would, because I think what I'm hearing is you don't want any of these security groups. You can't, like, your security won't allow Kappa to create any of these for you. So you need to be able to assign multiple security groups to each EC2 instance. And you may have some other security groups like for the load balancer, but presumably you're taking care of that setup yourself, right?
Well, he was saying they wanted the load balancer automated, so we would have to provide at least some way to get that part assigned.
Yeah. There's already a map here. This is in status though. Like, see, like there's a role to security group. What I'm hearing that like we might need multiple for each role, which is fine. Like we can just make a slice here instead of a one-to-one relationship. And if this moves into spec, that might be like a solution to the problem. And like if the user provides that, like we just don't reconcile them anymore.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying, is that if you specify security groups, or you kind of need a way to turn off reconciliation of security groups, except for maybe the ELB. But then at the machine level, or at the EC2 instance level, you just want to specify IDs and have them applied, and that's the end of the story there.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the differentiation with the load balancers?
I'm echoing something that Jason said based on something you said. So
I think we want to do the same process for every thing that needs a security group applied, including load balancers. And I think we're also going to be, so we would add a new role, I think, which would be like ingress load balancer.
Yeah, I think the roles in your situation, like the roles matter to you, but I think from an API standpoint, if we give you the ability to specify one or more security group IDs for the load balancer, and then one or more security group IDs per machine, which translate to an EC2 instance, does that give you everything that you need?
I think so. I'm just also, I don't want to, I'd like to, yeah, we're going to have our own providers, so we don't need to worry about, making changes to this area that would pollute the upstream. So I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I wanna echo what Andy said though before. Like this is not about polluting. This like adds like good kind of features to the product that like other folks might like need as well. So yeah, definitely like if you don't want to go the route like of just forking everything, like we definitely welcome contributions here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and I'm trying to figure out a way to make these changes that are flexible enough that people don't have to all of a sudden conform to our strange Capital One way of configuring a cluster.
Well, I mean, it seems reasonable to me that if you don't want to go with what Kappa has for defaults, then if you have a set of security group IDs, why not make it possible to assign them your choice to the load balancer and to the machines?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I know I'm 100% agreeing. I'm thinking about the implementation and how we would make it flexible enough that we don't lock anybody into a particular way of like I guess what we want is where that security group role slice is defined. I guess we want each of those roles to have a slice of security groups.
Oh, so like I'm suggesting there's no roles. Like you manage the roles logically in your Capital One isms, and anybody else who wants to manage roles can do it their own way. But from an API standpoint, you literally just have an array of security group IDs that are attached to the load balancer, and then an array of security group IDs that are associated with an EC2 instance with a machine. So if you want to have an ingress load balancer security group and a Capital One required, like, company-wide required security group, you can have those two IDs associated with a load balancer. And from Kappa's perspective, we don't need to know what their names are. That makes sense.
It makes sense in concept, and I think I think I just need to get more familiar with the data types here and how they hang together to see the implementation in my mind.
Yeah, I would suggest to maybe open an issue with your use case, like as we talked today, and we can just go back and forth to an issue, and maybe just do like a small kind of discuss the changes proposal, and then we can work towards the code base.
Okay, super.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. I won't take up any more of your time if I've got things to get to.
That's no worries. We've got about 10 or 11 minutes left, and the only thing left on the agenda is to look at open issues that we need to triage. So unless anybody has anything else, I'll just flip over to that.
Okay, I will drop. Thank you very much once again, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, thanks.
Bye, guys.
Okay, first I'm going to do issues with no milestone, and we have 3. This one is from a month ago. I thought all right, I'm just going to close this. Due to age. Okay, that one's done. Now we have a question from Chuck. Default cluster region.
Yeah, do we Is this possible, and do we want to do this? I think it's possible. It would just be nice to not re-specify the region around, but yeah, what's up?
You can have creds that are not, that don't have a region like in your config file though. Right?
Region is a required parameter today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be like an API change, I guess.
What is this? What is this applicable to? Is this for the machine or the cluster or both?
I believe it's both. I would have to open up my example to see.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you were talking about like cluster AWS ADM or something. But
Cluster. No. It's just AWS, just like regular cluster.
Okay.
So the AWS cluster requires the region along with each. No, the machine doesn't.
So the credentials are, so we create the session from the cluster region. That's why the cluster region is required today. We can get the environment variable, I guess, but like.
It may not necessarily be an environment variable though.
Yeah, it would be.
It may be in the config.
We need to read the metadata.
Well,
yeah.
and also if you want to create clusters in 2 different regions, I can't remember. Are we saying that people should have 2 different Kappa pods for that?
Would they? I think they would need to, because the.
No, we cache the sessions.
Oh, we cache the session per region.
Yeah.
Yep.
By credentials, I think.
So we can provide multiple sets of credentials per.
No, one set of credentials, and they work across all of AWS.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So is there a good default we could extract?
So I think after you generate the client, I think there might be a way, either generating the client or generating the session. I think there's a way to extract that information.
Mm-hmm.
So we could potentially use that as a default value.
I'm quite sure that we don't set the region right now in the credentials, and the only way to get a default credential would be the region that either the provider is deployed to or the cluster region name. That's why it's a required field.
Okay.
Well,
so
like the credentials that we're encoding into there, there's no reason why we couldn't also support the region being embedded in there as well, though. If somebody created their own AWS config with a region set in it, then it should work.
I guess that's true. It should work.
Because it would just pull it from the default lookup path.
So, I mean, maybe the action item here is encode the credentials secret with the region in it and make it so that AWS cluster region is optional and see if it works.
Yeah, I think so.
that sounds right. Yeah.
Actually, we do set the region.
We set the region where?
We set the region in the AWS credentials template in cluster AWS ADM, so it should already be in the secret.
We have at least one other issue to get to, so let's do priority and milestone.
Yeah, long term sounds good. This is an improvement that's not like strictly necessary.
And I'm just going to put this on next. You'll also notice I got rid of the V1 Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 from the milestone names because the /milestone command in a
That's annoying.
comment would require you to type that in. So I got rid of those.
Thank you.
And this one I started working on. I need to get back to it. This is so that we can add custom AWS tags to everything that we manage. Let me see if there's anything else in here. Or actually, this one is going to come in for, excuse the cattail, 04x. What else do we have? Yeah, pretty much everything else has a milestone. With the last 5 minutes, is there anything that you all want to discuss, either issue, pull request, or other? Okay, well, let's end 5 minutes early then. Thank you, everybody.